Mass rally held on that day, and we all know that there were some so-called violent incidents. We also know that after December 11 there are even more violent incidents, in fact much less spontaneous violent incidents, very, very well organised ones that have also had a deleterious effect on Sydney's ethnic relations, but I'll come to that down the track. We know from most reports, and I suppose most journalists who still have some honesty in them, that there was a long lead up to what happened on the December 11 down there at Cronulla. We know that there were years of racial harassment of Australians in the beach suburbs. We know that there were a litany of sexual assaults that took place in Sydney in the years 2000 to 2002. We know that there was finally an incident where some Australian lifesavers were brutally bashed several days before the incident at Cronulla on December 11. And we know that there was a lead up through the public media of text messaging and so forth calling people down there that day. However, if we were to believe that this is simply something that's come in many ways out of the sky, I think we'd be very, very wrong. Some of the confidential type people in the multi-culti industry, people such as Professor Mary Calancis and Mr Castles and Mr Cope and many of the others who write the books with amazing titles like Community Without Nation, Beyond Nationality and so on. These people say that what took place was in fact an earthquake and it had been brewing for a long time. This is what they say. It was fortunate for me that I actually witnessed the event. I went there. When I arrived in the general area, what I saw was, to use an old phrase from the 19th century, a festival of the oppressed. There was something in the vicinity of 5,000 to 7,000 persons in the general beach area of Cronulla, and I saw women and children and more young girls than I've ever seen anywhere in one place in all my life. I saw an area be decked out in the Australian national flag, the famous blue flag of Eureka, the boxing kangaroo flag. I saw people dressed in all sorts of bunting. I saw people caped in national flags. I even saw a bloke dressed as Ned Kelly. What I saw in the early phase of that day was simply a festival. I would also put to you that not since the time of 1966, if we go back to 1966 when the famous White Australia policy was abandoned, I would use the term betrayed, there has never, ever, ever been a crowd like this. There have been demonstrations, there have been strikes, there have been all sorts of political parties which have questioned the pattern of Australia's immigration and multicultural policy. But there has never been a crowd turned out in a single place on an issue like this. After the so-called riot phase that took place at about 2 o'clock, and you've all seen certain photos and all that on TV, I need not belabour it. One very, very significant fact occurred to me, that this was the first time also since 1966 that the Australian people were masters of their own streets, because all serious political politics begins in the street. I was interviewed a little later in the afternoon, I think about 20 to 3, by a lady from 2GB, and already a number of the things that occurred to me, because I took a notebook and I wrote down everything I could. I come to the conclusion, folks, that a line would soon emerge. I actually wrote down that the line would be that alcohol had been a problem. Now there were some people with tinnies, I saw that. There were some blokes with slabs of beer under their arm, I saw that too. There were some bottles thrown, I saw that too. But what I did not see is 5,000 drunks. I did not see that. It did not happen. But it occurred to me that the media would say that it did. It also occurred to me that they would say that people had come from other areas in Sydney to be louts and troublemakers. And it also occurred to me that they would start talking about outside extremists or whatnot who had come down there to incite the crowd. Now bear in mind, the police videoed all of this. We know that. If anyone had been making provocative speeches or inciting crowds or giving out alcohol, the coppers would have caught it. Didn't happen. Some of the events there, the so-called violent phase, were spontaneous events. And that interview was aired at about 4 o'clock. Come the next day, sure enough, the line had begun to emerge. Lie one that's been pursued by the media was this, that all of the events that took place there were the products of alcohol. And we've heard that repeated over and over and over again, that it was all the fact that the boys were drunk and they got carried away and they did things. But as I said to you, 5,000 people weren't drunk. On the Today program, Tracy Grimshaw, from recollection, it's a rather confused sequence, said that either I personally or guys from the Australia First Party, whatever, actually distributed alcohol. Now, if you had done that, that would also not only be a breach of their alcohol laws, but it would be an offence in the overall context of things. Or as one wag said, you would have had to have a bloody big truck. But there's no film of that either. Lie number two is that all this was somehow or other instigated by outsiders. Well, that one's never really washed too much. They concentrated on, you know, Westie blokes coming in from Parramatta and Blacktown and, you know, the young thugs and all that. They wanted to go down there and cause some trouble. But it's fairly clear that the vast majority of people at Cronulla that day were locals. But there were a lot of blokes who came from other areas. That's certainly true. The real event at issue really was, it wasn't simply a protest of the people in Cronulla, it was a protest of anyone who was Australian who lived in Sydney who was welcome to come. And that seemed to be the import of what was being said in the lead up to it, even by certain radio shock jocks. Basically, therefore, it was a mass demonstration. Lie number three was consistently developed by the media over time. They said that it was all something to do with white supremacists. Now, this story arose very quickly. It's been peddled very widely. I didn't see them there either. I actually looked. I looked to see whether or not there was anyone who really looked out of place. And I must admit, in the whole time, I think I saw one bloke who you'd classify as a skinhead, right? 1 in 5,000, 1 in 7,000. Forget it. I also thought that the term white supremacist was actually a term that related to the Democratic Party in the United States in the years 1865 to about 1875 and had something to do with the so-called Reconstruction period in the states, the former states of the Confederacy. But apparently the meaning of the term has now changed, and it's something that's trotted out from the media to concern anyone who protests over any issue of race in Australia. I was also called one. I went back over my particular writings. I can't seem to find anything that particularly justifies the label, but that's what they say. Lie number four was that it had something to do with neo-Nazis. Now, I remember I spoke here at this forum 5 years ago about those guys. I looked for the 10 or 12 mental midgets who make up that fraternity, and I didn't see them at Cronulla either. Although, I'm reliably told by several journalists they were everywhere. Well, neither I nor many comrades of mine saw them, and the best impress is that they were not there at all. These lies were summed together a few days later at a meeting at the Surf Lifesaving Club, all conveniently organised by the local mayor, the ex-Liberal Mr Schreiber and many others, with representatives of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation in attendance. They got seen driving off in their protective services vehicle, one dressed as a surfie, one dressed casual and one dressed like me, sort of like May, Larry and Shem. But they were there. And an apology was written and signed by the surf guys, written in this amazing government ease, saying that it was all the product of alcohol, outsiders and racist extremists who invaded their turf on this particular day to perpetrate actions, and better don't drop the comma and put the semicolon. Most of the surf guys don't write that way. In fact, it was written by ASIO, almost certainly. In other words, they simply invented a marketable lie. This lie was exposed, and several days later they actually admitted that, yeah, we'd been there. I'd take it further, they wrote the apology. Why would you bother writing an apology of this sort? Well, there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that the brief of communal violence is part of the brief of the secret police, and they don't want this thing they call communal violence. And they're particularly worried that any number, and there were thousands of them, remember what I said, folks, This was a radical crowd. There has never been a crowd like this turned out on the issue of immigration and multiculturalism before, ever in our country. The secret police were concerned, are concerned, that any number of people who were there, the families, the people themselves, may become voters, supporters, activists, so on and so forth for political movements. You mustn't have that. Not at all. Australia's future is being set as part of the Pacific